Yes, welcome everyone. So as I mentioned, this session is live streamed on Facebook and we are recording as well, meaning that this session will be available to you in both video and audio formats afterwards. And it will be available on YouTube and on various podcast platforms. Welcome to our Diversity and Inclusion in the Workplace session on the DEI Buzzwords. And the full title of this amazing session is actually pulling the plug on DEI Buzzwords. So it's quite a catchy title. I hope we managed to bring you in just as buzzwords are supposed to. And yes, so we are very happy to have you all in here with us today. As always, we are looking forward to a lively discussion in the chat. So we have just started with a simple question of where are you joining us from? So we got you engaged in there, but we are looking forward to seeing more of that as we always do. So just make sure whenever you feel like the question we are discussing is interesting for you or you want to add your comments, just write it in the chat. And in case you have any questions coming up for the panelists, just make it a bit easier for me and always preface your question with the word question so that I will be able to find them at the last 30 minutes of this session, where we are going to have a Q&A session with you, the audience. And also in case you want to direct the question at any of the panelists, make sure to write their name in brackets as well, just so that it's easier for me to moderate that later. Just a few technicalities as well. This session will take 120 minutes, so 2 hours, out of which the first 90 minutes are reserved for the discussion in between our panelists. And then the last 30 minutes, as I have already mentioned, are for the Q&A session, and the floor is open for your questions. So don't be shy, ask questions. We are ready for you. I believe our panelists are very ready for the questions and excited about them. So today is our 11th panel discussion within the series of diversity and inclusion in the workplace, which is powered by Diversify and Herspace. We are still having a few people joining in. So welcome, welcome for those of you who are joining us now. This session is actually going to be the last for this year. And it's our early Christmas gift for you because Christmas is coming up in 1 month and 1 day. I'm very excited about that. Yes, and just to not take much more time of the session, we are going to start with a short introduction, so so that you get to know our panelists a little bit. Maybe you know some of us, maybe you don't. So I'm just going to start briefly. My name is Susanna Warden. I am a project and research manager with Diversify, and my background is in social work, project management, and international development cooperation. And I am a beginner in diversity and inclusion. So these sessions are a very valuable resource for me. And yes, I am now going to give the word to our amazing panelists. So maybe we can start with Natasha today. Oh. Natasha, can you start by introducing yourself briefly?
Sure. Hi, thank you. So I'm Natasha Delisle-Barrow. I'm a people and culture partner based in London. Although I'm based in London, I actually work with companies across sort of Europe, mainly sort of tech startups and scale-up companies to embed culture across their various people practices. I am a she, her. For those of you who may be visually impaired, I'm wearing a white shirt with a beaded necklace. I'm a dark-skinned Afro-Caribbean girl. I'm also wearing a leopard print headband, so I thought a bit of colour as well for today. And that's me essentially.
Thank you very much, Natasha. So next one on my screen is Rahwa.
Hi, well, my name is Rahwa Johannes. I am an activist, public speaker, social critic, and I work at well, that's not why I'm here, but I do work at the Norwegian Council for Africa. I am I'm very much about social justice, and I think that is something that we need to keep working on in Norway and, well, all over the world as well. I'm not very good at introducing myself, just in case you haven't noticed. Well, I'm wearing blue shirt. I have my curls out, and I am actually joining in from Strasbourg, and I have a giant screen behind me. Let's see, I am of Ethiopian descent, and I live in Oslo, Norway, and I'm also a she, her.
Thank you, Rahwa. I actually thought it was a window behind you, so it's
No, it is, well,
it's
I think the windows are reflecting
in the
on the screen, yeah, so, yeah.
That's what's happening, yes. And the last panelist to introduce yourself is Chisom.
Hi. I'm thinking that for people who join all the time, like every time, I should probably come up with more cool things or funny things to say about myself. Unfortunately, I'm not funny, so that's that. My name is Chisom Udeze. I am Nigerian by the way of the world. I have happy feet, so I've lived a few places. I am an economist and a diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging consultant, expert, enthusiast, activist. Yeah. My pronouns are she, her. And today I am wearing, I think sometimes I'm colorblind, but I think this is brown. I'm wearing like a brown sweater, turtleneck. Have my hair in a bun to the back. And in my screen, I think you could see a bit of my plants and a tiny part of my wall mirror. I'm happy to be here. Really happy to have a conversation today with both Rahwa and Tasha. And I am also the founder of Diversify and Her Space. So this initiative is one that is very close to my heart. And these conversations help me learn and also process a lot of things I feel about DEI. So happy to be here.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Chisom. I think you have managed to add in something new because we didn't know you had happy feet. So that's a new add today. And thank you all for actually reminding us of the inclusion part within this digital session, and that is to actually describing yourself for the visually impaired participants. So I'm gonna join with that as well. I'm white female, quite pale in the face, skinny, with the long brown dreadlocks, and I'm wearing a black blazer and a red shirt, and I have a probably beige background behind me. So that's a description of myself. And yes, I think without further ado, let's just get right onto the topic of discussing DEI buzzwords. I think it's a very important discussion that needs to be had in when it comes to diversity and inclusion, because even those words themselves are buzzwords. And what are buzzwords? You know, is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Well, let me ask Chisom. Since we are addressing DEI buzzwords today, can you explain to us what buzzwords actually are? Is it a positive or a negative term?
Thanks, Susanna. Buzzwords, I guess, just to define, you know, they're words or phrases that might already be in existence or new, but they become trendy, popular, or fashionable at a particular point in time. So an example, well, some examples would be pain point, it's a buzzword. Hit the ground running is a buzzword. Think outside the box is a buzzword, right? Buzzwords aren't necessarily bad or good, and they can also be positive or negative. You know, they serve, but in general, they serve as a way to quickly communicate something in professional settings or social settings. Now, within the context of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, which I will be referring to as DEIB sometimes, they have become quite fashionable in some countries more than others, you know, and I think that the participation or the bandwagonry have skyrocketed since 2020 with the, you know, in the wake of BLM, COVID, all of that. Some DEI buzzwords, which I am pretty sure we're going to talk about today, things like psychological safety, bringing your full self to work, unconscious bias training, or even leaning, right? And they've been used as a catch-all umbrella term to capture challenges or intricacies within DEI. Unfortunately, in many cases, when they are used by companies, leaders, or workplaces, within the context of what you understand DEI to be, it might cause you to wonder if the person or the company actually using it truly understands what it means to feel psychologically safe or to bring your full self to work. So I'm going to stop there.
Thank you for an introduction. I was already looking for ways how to you know, get you to stop so that you don't reveal too much of what's coming up, but you just found the perfect timing yourself. So yes, you know, in case of buzzwords and these labels, maybe that we can call them more umbrella terms. Natasha, could you tell us what are the dangers of umbrella terms within the context of diversity, equity, and inclusion? And can you maybe explain this with some specific examples?
Yeah, sure. You know what? I actually think there are sort of pros and cons to umbrella terms and some labels. The world is really complex, and I guess classification means that we can impose a certain sense of order and find relationships in things which are hidden. I guess people love labels and organizing things into a simple and understandable format. So I guess that's kind of a pro, I suppose, really. Sometimes they do give people support and guidance. It allows those people potentially where a diagnosis may be required to feel part of a bigger group. And better understand their perspectives and their approaches. I guess really when I talk about that, I'm talking particularly about neurodivergency, for example. But where umbrella terms can sometimes be problematic is that they can actually stop us doing the hard work. So what tends to happen with umbrella terms is that sometimes we get a lot of tokenism around that, particularly when we look at labels such as BAME, for example, or neurodivergency or something like that. What they do is they become more of a tick box exercise and prevent us from doing that hard work that's required to achieve diverse representation and inclusivity. Also, labels don't work for everyone. You know, they can limit how the world sees and responds to us. So, for example, if you're somebody who's maybe identified as autistic, that may be all people see. And as a result, we only ever see the challenges a person may face and forget to embrace their strengths. We also ignore them, their lived experiences. And that then means that we forget about things like intersectionality. I mean, at the end of the day, does anybody really fit into just the one box? Because I know I certainly don't. And so then that can lead to stereotyping. So what you then have is our perception of a person can often change, and we end up stereotyping them. So again, with autism, how many times have you heard that autistic people may be great at coding or tech or great at maths? So that's one aspect of it. The term, or the umbrella term, that I particularly take issue with is BAME, which is the Black, Asian, Minority Ethnic label. The reason for that, if you look at that term Asian in particular, what you've done is you've taken something like nearly 50 different nationalities, cultures and languages, and you've reduced them into one term. And Asia makes up something like 60% of the world's population. And so when you have labels like that, you forget to recognize that. You also have this term that often means that it also sort of says that anybody who's BAME is just not white. And again, it leads to further marginalization. One of the things that I should point out here is that that term minority ethnic actually does refer to white minorities such as traveller groups, Romas, and what have you. But what happens if you're multiracial? Where do you fit in then? So again, if you look at this panel, we're all women of, the panelists are all women of Black heritage. But this really is where our similarities end. You know, I refer to my specific ethnicity as Black, British, Caribbean, but I wouldn't expect Chisholm or Rawa to speak on my behalf or understand my lived experiences or speak about them on my behalf. And on the same note, I wouldn't expect someone who's British East Indian to speak on behalf of somebody who is, I don't know, Vietnamese just because they're Asian. So those are sort of the aspects that I particularly sort of really want to draw attention to. I guess the next label for me would be the, well, we do have to pay particular attention to is the LGBTQIA+ label, given that so many workplace diversity initiatives focus solely on sexual orientation inclusivity and can often overlook the transgender or gender non-conforming experience. And that is also another umbrella term. So again, it's really for me the specifics about labeling and ignoring lived experience. So yeah, I'll end it there because I could carry on for quite a while.
And we could listen for quite a while. This was really a great explanation. And I think it got us all thinking and just, you know, yearning for more depth in this conversation. So thank you so much, Natasha, for, you know, getting us deeper into this topic. And yeah, so when you were talking about, you know, stereotyping people, it just made me think about tokenization of people as well, which is connected to that. And I have the following question for Rahwa. Rahwa, could you tell us what is tokenism and how does it affect the mental health of employees and the overall work atmosphere?
Well, I mean, tokenism can, you asked about, oh, by the way, I'm going to be moving around a little bit because the sun keeps finding me. So sorry about that. But basically, tokenism is to hire or keep someone around in social contexts just to avoid criticism and appear as if you're actively doing something about, you know, lack of diversity, lack of inclusion. And it often costs people dearly because just because you have brought in people of a certain minority status, doesn't mean that the space is safe for you. Now, Natasha mentioned, you know, what multiracial really means. And the way I understand it in most cases is that anything that diverts, that is, you know, that diverts from white is not the standard, and therefore that's when you kind of go into the other category. So if one is, say, hired to be a token, most of the times they're just decoration, which means it kind of implies that that's the only reason that they're there and that's the only function that they serve. And what then happens is how how do their colleagues see them, for example? Because a lot of people, most of the times when we're talking about diversity and inclusion and the need for people to, not only integrate, but be present in circles, there is a question of meritocracy. But then if you're hired to be a token, nobody's going to respect you, and every judgment that you make in the workplace is going to be put to question. Are you really qualified to say X or to decide this or that? On top of the biases that come with racism, ableism, sexism, homophobia, etc., it always there will always be that that thought or that perception of that person that is there as if they're not really qualified to be there, or they don't belong there and they're getting special treatment. And then you have, and people maybe might question, like, well, if you know that you're being hired as a token, then why are you really accepting this? And most of the times, the positionality of this person doesn't really allow them to say no. Not always, right? And if anyone lives in Norway, you understand, you know that it doesn't matter what your qualifications are. If you are not Norwegian, you will face some challenges in finding your space or finding work or whatever. So what happens then is that a lot of the people that are in that space, they have to work twice as hard to just prove themselves, and the likelihood of them actually climbing the ladder is going to be very little. Yeah, so I'll just continue later.
Yes, thank you for the answer, Rahwa. It really just brings out, the challenges faced by different people within different minority groups. And, there are many buzzwords that are kind of about the psychological safety, as Chisholm has mentioned previously. So Chisholm, I'm coming back to you, thinking about these buzzwords that came up surrounding mental health at the workspace. Can you tell us what you think about buzzwords like psychological safety and bringing your full self to work, and how these buzzwords could be harmful?
Thanks, Susanna. Just to clarify, I guess I need to toss in my disclaimer first. I believe that psychological safety in the workplace or society is extremely important. It allows us to feel safe to take risks, to trust and be vulnerable in front of each other. In a workplace setting, it leads to high performance, innovation, clarity, dependability, even better decision making. When teams and employees feel psychologically safe, they are comfortable to admit mistakes. They learn from failure. They openly share ideas, and they are valued exactly as they are. Now, where DEI is concerned, psychological safety and bringing your full self to work, or a company saying that they want to hire diverse candidates, can be harmful when companies do not really understand or do not fully comprehend what they are talking about. And this is a complex matter that I cannot fully cover for the sake of time, because I can talk about this for like 2 days, and Susanna knows. So I will place them in specific context, and instead I would like to raise some questions. So how can someone feel psychologically safe when they see that their leaders or their team does not fully understand what it feels like to be them, or if they are questioned, if they say something happened, and then you hear back, are you sure? Are you sure you're not overthinking it? Imagine if you're non-binary and queer single parent who is often misgendered, and you have a child with disability, and you work in a cisgendered male-dominated space where performance is key and work balance is for mere mortals. How can you bring your full self to work as a high-functioning, say, biracial woman with a gorgeous afro who struggles with mental health challenges and anxiety disorder? What if you actually start believing that you can feel psychologically safe because your employers keep talking about it, but your manager keeps misidentifying you in the case of the non-binary person? You know, what if those who are often promoted at your workplace, you know, are the people who can work from dusk till dawn without children to care for? Or as the biracial woman, you know, if you're told to put your hair in a tighter bun because your curls or afro are not professional. These things cause emotional harm, especially when we begin to believe that we can actually feel safe in a workplace, right? And when you start feeling that emotional betrayal, every sense of psychological safety flies out of the window. And on psychological safety and bringing your full self to work, something I've been really interrogating lately is which full self are we actually referring to? You know, when I speak to leaders about this, it's the, you know, like be the direct and the aggressive and the bubbly and outgoing and loud and fun and direct self. Now, this parts of ourselves are popularly conducive to the workplace. Now, my question is, can I bring my tired self as a parent who did not sleep all night because my child was sick? Or can a man working hard to manage and legally medicate the onset of a bipolar episode, or a depressed person who also struggles with anxiety, can they bring that part of themselves to work? You know, can I bring my full self who today is crying to work, right? Because oftentimes these characteristics that are glorified as bring your full self to work are not really all of who we are. And oftentimes it's only the cool stuff that are relevant for the workplace. So something for us to think about.
Yes, thank you, Jisom. And we will definitely stay within this topic for a little bit longer, because my next question goes to Natasha. I would like to ask you, Natasha, could you deconstruct the imposter syndrome to us, and also address the scapegoating of the imposter syndrome? In this regard, is the problem always a lack of confidence, or is it something else as well?
Well, really interesting one. And imposter syndrome for me is quite a big topic, but I'll try and keep this really succinct. I think it's really important, first of all, to know the origins of the term imposter syndrome and why it exists. And it originally goes back to two psychologists, ladies called Pauline Clance and Susanna Warden, who in the 70s conducted a study of high achieving, and I'm going to say cis women. The study really was based over a 5-year period and looked at women who were really well respected in their field, who had earned PhDs and in their speciality. Now, originally the term was called Imposter Phenomenon. And what they found through this study was that despite, and I'm quoting here, despite outstanding academic and professional achievements, women who experience the imposter phenomenon persist in believing that they are really not bright and have fooled anyone who thinks otherwise. So the first part of that to acknowledge is that it was a study that was carried out solely on women. And so given the timescales of that as well, we can probably assume that they were white women as well. Now, since then, we've had thousands of studies and programs and initiatives. There are coaches everywhere who can really help with regards to addressing imposter syndrome. Google can point you in a direction of so many different articles and studies and white papers, and it can tell you everything you need to know about imposter syndrome. But what we should be aware of, and what we should never forget, is that it is a human condition. Feeling insecure, feeling uncomfortable, nervous, mild levels of anxiety is not a women-only problem. It's, you know, that lack of self-confidence does play a big part and is often the catalyst of imposter syndrome. But what the study didn't look at was things like systemic discrimination or biases. The study didn't examine other gender identities as well. It didn't consider people with physical impairments. It didn't look at race, ethnicity. In fact, it was quite a narrow study by today's standards. And so what the study has done is it's put the subsequent focus of imposter syndrome fairly on the shoulders of women. and only women. It means that society, workplaces, institutions have all been absolved from any responsibility, because the problem and its fix is for women to solve. And that's a really heavy burden to bear. When I then sort of, you look and you start deconstructing the actual wording and the language of imposter syndrome, well, an imposter is someone who pretends to be someone else in order to deceive others, and it's there for sort of fraudulent gain. Being an imposter is actually intentional, it's calculated, it's well thought out. And the syndrome refers to something sort of more medical that is treatable through therapy and what have you. But as I said, you know, we really want to understand more about the systems which allow or really help, you know, imposter syndrome to thrive. And we really should be looking at that more. So I guess where the scapegoating comes in is by making it a women-only problem. And so I'll leave it there for now.
Yes, thank you so much. You really got me thinking. I'm actually trying to digest everything you have just said, and so many thoughts come to my mind. I remember actually reading an article about a lady, an African-American lady who has ended up leaving her workspace thinking, you know, that all the responsibility was on her shoulders, and she was having the imposter syndrome, when actually looking back, she realized there were just so many barriers that she was facing on a day-to-day basis, so many microaggressions that actually she didn't put into the equation when she was at the workspace. But it wasn't just all about her feeling incompetent for some reason, or not confident enough to do the work she was doing. So thank you for shedding some light on this topic for us. And I would just like to come back to Chisom, because you were mentioning, you know, in terms of, because during the last panel discussion we had, we talked about disability inclusion, and we also talked about invisible disabilities. And you have mentioned, you know, people living with different mental health challenges, such as, I don't know, for example, depression, anxiety. And, you know, in terms of bringing your full self to work, which you have already described or, you know, discussed about, could you just tell us a bit more about how might mental health intersect with psychological safety, identity, and workplace disclosure? So let's just focus on that part of, you know, disclosure.
It is a very complex question. And I should say publicly as well that I live with an invisible disability because I struggle with depression and anxiety. Now to your question. I think that historically speaking, some groups have been marginalized so much so it is difficult for them to feel safe. Now, take for example the latest thing in my brain, which is the case of Kyle Rittenhouse in the US, a white man who shot 3 other white men during a protest in Kenosha, I believe. And he was recently acquitted of all charges, right? So the jury made a decision, and that's the law. So we have to stand by it. But many people, myself included, believe that had Kyle been a person of color, the verdict would have been completely different. Do I know this for an absolute fact? No. Is my belief nonetheless backed by fact? Absolutely. Time and time again, we've seen it happen, where you even hear of people of color going to prison for petty crimes like smoking marijuana, right? Whereas you take a gun, you go kill a bunch of people, and you go scot-free because it's self-defense. Now, is this an extreme example? Yes, but I'm hoping to use it to make a point here. When psychological safety comes into play, is it easy for people of underrepresented groups to disclose, say, invisible disabilities like mental health? Perhaps not, because unless I feel 100% safe with the person and leadership that I'm reporting to, and so long as my disability does not strenuously affect my work or make me unable to execute on my projects, I'll more than likely keep it to myself and not disclose because I'm afraid of what might come. Now, my primary reason, just talking about myself, for doing this, I say threefold. First, I am Black. Second, I'm a woman. And third, let's say I work in finance and then I work in a male-dominated industry. There might be different intersectionalities that compounds my unwillingness to disclose because I believe that disclosure might work against me. Do I know this to be 100% fact? No. Is it nonetheless backed by fact and experience? Yes. Now, this is where it gets, difficult to navigate. So how do I feel psychologically safe when I have to deal with both realities, right? On one hand, I should disclose because, that's the right thing to do. I should feel safe enough to do so. But on the other hand, I know that disclosure might come with repercussions that might affect me, right? So I think this is where disclosure intersects with psychology, psychological safety, and identity, depending on, again, intersectionality, which those of you who know me know that that is my love language. Now, should we be at a point in society and at the workplace where we can disclose our identities? Think about people within the queer communities. I think absolutely yes. Should I feel comfortable disclosing my visible, invisible disabilities? Yes, but unfortunately, we're not there yet. Now, for people who feel safe enough to disclose, congratulations. You're working at a company or thriving in a society that has succeeded with making you feel the necessary psychological safety, and that should be a fundamental human right. And this is how we should be. For some people, however, not disclosing is survival. So it's complicated.
I see. Thank you, Jisung. It is truly a complicated topic, and it also just makes me think of, we're expecting that a healthy working environment or an inclusive space means that everybody will disclose everything about themselves and, we'll just put all the cards on the table, but that's probably not what it's supposed to be. It's actually supposed to be a place where you can freely decide for yourself what is healthy for you and what not. And if not disclosing works for you, then perfect, do that.
Absolutely.
Thank you. So yes, my next question will go to Rahwa. It's quite a long one, so I hope you will bear with me. So I have mentioned, a healthy working environment, and that is a prerequisite of a decent workspace, naturally. Mm-hmm. And when talking about decent workspaces, they have been a part of the Sustainable Development Goals and sustainability, which is a buzzword by itself, but we're not going to talk about the sustainability part at the moment. We are going to go back to the decent workspaces. Rahwa, how do you think workplaces across the world and Norway are actually doing in supporting decent working environments for everyone?
Well, that is a big question. But I mean, when I think about sustainability, like we often associate it with environmental crisis, right? But that's not just it. We have there are so many goals that actually intersect with decent work and the entire it's inclusion and diversity, good health, gender equality, decent work and economic growth, sustainable cities and communities, peace, justice, strong institutions. All of those have inclusivity in their definition. However, what happens when your workplace is the cause of your mental health strain? There was a recent issue at a workplace with a Black trans man, and the cause of the mental health issue was the colleagues and the workplace that wasn't safe. And when this man went and complained to his boss, this is the answer he got. Maybe it's because of your original gender that you're reacting so much. You're being sensitive. Yeah. So I know. So when we talk sustainability, we also have to be careful to also be very mindful of the other goals and people's well-being. So how are we doing in Norway? Well, we don't even know how to go about diversity and inclusion, and I think we have a very long way to go. And a lot of organizations have the audacity to have employees or short-term hired experts to come and talk about inclusion without, properly even understanding what it actually means and how to make even that a safe environment for people to be able to express themselves. Now I'm talking about the minorities because they're going to be a part of that, and they're going to be talking about the issues that they have to face at work. So it is about understanding the needs of people within an organization and making it a safe environment where everyone is held accountable. And without accountability, you don't have a safe space. You don't. So until people or organizations learn to do what, in workplaces, it won't be sustainable. It will not be, because the margins within the margins have to be safe. If they're not safe, then we're doing something very wrong. And I think that you need experts, and real experts, not experts that are going to be coming in singing Kumbaya that are going to fix this problem. We need experts like Natasha and people that have been working on this like for a long time. Chisom. You need people like that are going to be training and assessing the workplace and its safety for people over a long period of time before we can say that everyone is going to be fine. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Rahua. I actually see that Emma has pinpointed a quote of yours that I wrote it down and I wanted to just say it. Without accountability, you don't have a safe space. And just as you said, a lot of organizations, companies, businesses are now, trying to jump on the bandwagon and, be diverse and inclusive without actually realizing they have to bring in the accountability first. Before you even start being diverse, you cannot try to catch up once, the problems are already arising. You have to think beforehand and get ready. So thank you so much for answering this question for us.
If I may, Susanna,
yes, definitely.
I think as well on accountability and safe spaces and bandwagonry. I think that what perhaps companies need to realize is how, I think for people who feel like they can't speak up because their jobs or their next job depends on it, it's quite harmful what they deal with. And I think for DEI practitioners, I think there's a reason why there's a quite significant turnover for DEI practitioners, because it's really exhausting to do this work where you see that people are just more, what's it called? They're more focused with window dressing as opposed to actually doing the work. So it's complex and it's complicated. And it's, I guess the hope would be that companies or leaders who listen to this or listen to something else actually take the time to understand the importance of building a solid foundation and making sure there is measurement and accountability to a lot of projects or initiatives that they take on.
Yes, Chisom, actually, since you are already opening up this topic, I think we can actually talk a bit more about that, because now the whole point comes to, how can workspaces actually become inclusive? So could you actually tell us just what does inclusion actually mean and entail, and what are some of the threats to inclusive leadership?
I feel like I've said this recently, or I've written about it recently, and I know, I work with Susanna, so she knows I have vented about this recently as well. So I'm going to say this again. I'm going to keep saying it until I feel that it is understood, at least in Norway. Diversity is completely different from inclusion. It's often used as the same thing. It's often used as the same thing as gender equality, but let's not go there. So let's stick with diversity. Diversity is easy, right? I think it's just a numbers game. It's a science. You can calculate it. You can use your eyes and say, okay, that's a different person, that's a different person, that's a woman, that's a non-binary person, whatever it is, right? Inclusion is hard. It is an art. Like you have to paint and paint and revisit and repaint, right? Because it takes work and it involves people. And so long as people are involved and people continue to evolve, you have to continue to evolve. I kind of think of inclusion about with regards to, I don't know if it's Maya Angelou that said, like, when you know better, do better. Like, do the best you can until you know better. And when you know better, do better. It might be her, it might be somebody else. But so basically, inclusive leadership is really what it sounds like. It's about including everyone. It specifically places emphasis of having the courage to consciously and intentionally break down barriers for people at risk of being excluded from a workplace or society. It's not an easy job. It takes stress. It takes, I like to say blood, but really not blood, but it's emotionally and physically exhausting, and we need to be fully engaged. So I think a really good research that was done about inclusive leadership, I believe was from Dillon and Burke. I think it was from 2016, I may be wrong, wrote that the characteristics of inclusive leadership involve commitment to the cause. So usually inclusive leadership or inclusive leaders have a deep-rooted sense of what is fair. And oftentimes it is layered with or bolstered by lived experience. They have courage to admit when they don't have all the answers. They are aware of bias, and they know that personal and organizational bias can negatively impact diversity and inclusion. Inclusive leaders have intercultural, cross-cultural, and essentially emotional intelligence or cultural intelligence, and they are willing to collaborate. Now, some of the, you asked about what are the threats to inclusive leadership. Some of the challenges or threats to inclusive leadership are homogeneity. Like if you have an homogeneous workplace, ethnocentrism, cultural fit, because a lot of companies to this day still hire for cultural fit. If you hire for cultural fit, you're hiring people who look like you, who went to the same schools, who you can recognize yourself in, and you're not hiring for cultural contribution or cultural add. Another threat to inclusive leadership is the belief about an individual or group to be the same, right? So if you see, all right, Rahwa, Natasha, and Chisom are Black women, so they're exactly the same, right? They have the same need, like Natasha pointed out earlier, right? And another bias that could threaten inclusive leadership is the like me bias. Where essentially you want to hire people who look like you or people who look like the people who are currently employed at that company, right? And the last threat that I will mention is a perceived sense of loss as a threat to their career or progression or attainment. So for example, imagine wanting to be an inclusive leader, but you want to support a contentious diversity initiative, but you say, oh no, let me not speak up because it might stop me from being promoted, right? And that is not necessarily, the onus is not on you, but also the workplace that even allows that to be possible, where you cannot speak your truth or speak truth to power without fear of punishment, right? I personally know a lot of people who are afraid of speaking up because they are worried about their career. And I completely understand why.
Thank you, Chisom. I hope everybody is taking notes. If not, this session is being recorded because we are getting some education for free here from all our panelists. So thank you again to all our panelists for these amazing insights. We are actually having a few of our participants also adding some comments in the chat. So thank you so much for interacting with us. I see Kat has been writing a few comments. Thank you so much for that. I see there's a question in there as well. So I will ask that during the Q&A session. But we do have Sam mentioning I'm just going to read it out loud, that the diversity is representation of different people in an organization, while inclusion is when everyone in that organization has an equal opportunity to contribute to and influence every part and level of a workplace. So thank you, Sam, for also sharing this definition you have in the chat. And I definitely encourage all our participants to add in any questions that arise in your minds while our panelists are spitting fire and sharing their wisdom with us. So let's move on to the next question. I just need to find it here on my list. So I am going to address this question to Natasha. I would like to ask you, taking into consideration the organizational design and work culture, how can inclusion strategies be successfully implemented in the workplace? That's a practical question there.
Okay, so this is the area of my work that I absolutely love. And just to be really clear about what organizational design is, it's literally everything. So within companies and within businesses, it's absolutely everything. It's the structure, the systems, it's the processes, and it's the culture. It's all the things a company needs to really accelerate and thrive and achieve its strategic goals. One thing that we often see is that a lot of business leaders can often forget the impact of culture on strategic goals. There's a really famous quote by a guy called Peter Drucker. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. And what he means by that is, I guess it doesn't really matter how strong your business plan is or your strategic goal is. It's ultimately your people who will impact its success. So when you add diversity, equity, inclusion into your organizational design, it's given strategic intent. So this then means that it's no longer just, say, an HR or a people focus, but it becomes an everyone focus. So everybody within the organization starts to live and breathe it, and they do that in a more authentic, sustainable way. So that includes everybody from the board. And I should mention as well that we see this a lot more with investors as well. Investors are very, very keen to see DEI strategies, for example, and will measure investment potential based on that as well. So it's really, really important. Also, what it means is that when you make it a strategic intent, you move it away from one of those really nice to haves. It doesn't become optical, okay? Like I said, it becomes sustainable, it becomes long term. And this got me thinking, I don't know if you remember, like a couple of months ago or weeks ago, is it Facebook had like this global outage. I call it Facebook, but it's Meta now, isn't it? And it affected a lot of social media platforms, right? Instagram and WhatsApp and obviously Facebook as well. And it was around the world. And it made me think that how would most companies then operate their DEI if they didn't have a social media platform in which to showcase it? And that's the difference between the optical illusion and the organizational design, because organizational design means that you're not putting black squares on Instagram whilst you're paying, while there are, gender pay gaps within your organization, or you're not progressing people of different ethnicities and races within your organization. It means that you're not just posting about International Women's Day, but then have a gender pay gap, for example. So it becomes a lot more authentic and real. And one of the things that we always look at when we look at organizational design are these things called cultural drivers, the factors that really drive strategy. And these can be divided into things which are formal or informal. So if we were to look at sort of, I don't know, motivators as an example, on a more formal matter, this would be things like pay and reward. We'd look at the progression and growth opportunities. We'd look at performance enablement. On a more informal level, this would be about how the individual then approaches motivation. This could be about their own individual goals and their own individual aspirations and how those connect to those more formal levers that we have. Another one then could be sort of, I don't know, decision making. So on a formal level, decision making is dictated by hierarchy, but actually in a lot of organizations now we're seeing that moving away into more sort of culture and values, so people themselves sharing information, their beliefs. So DEI is really, really quite critical to the success of strategic intent and achievement. And really culture at the heart of that gives a place and a platform for DEI to be embedded within strategy. So again, looking at those potential disparities, ensuring that benefits are equitable for everyone. So, you know, a tip of mine, for example, is making sure that healthcare provisions aren't discriminating against older workers or discriminating against your trans communities, making sure that a good candidate experience during your recruitment and hiring strategy allows people to be assessed in a way which is fair and in a way that allows them to showcase their strengths. So there are various touch points and lots of different touch points in which you can embed it quite seamlessly into different aspects of your company and your business.
Thank you, Natasha. This was some heavy content.
A big subject.
It's a huge subject, yes, and it really, just to me at least, from everything you have said, boils down to having a proper strategy and keeping up with it and working with professionals such as you who can actually help to design these strategies in a realistic manner and not just build, you know, sand castles or cloud castles and just just do it for the show. Yes, Chisom?
I just added an accountability, because if you have a great strategy and not accountability, nothing happens as well.
Absolutely, completely agree.
Yes, exactly. Thank you so much for adding that, Chisom. I would just like to tell to our participants, thank you so much, Emma, for actually following up on my request. But yes, just as Emma did, in case you are having any questions, please just preface the question itself with the word question so that it's easier for me to figure out whether it's a comment or a question coming up. Yes, so thank you. And let's move on, you know, from strategies on how to do things well in terms of diversity and inclusion. Let's talk about, you know, the diversity and inclusion trainings or, you know, the unconscious bias trainings, which have become quite the buzzwords lately. So I'm going to ask Chisom here, you know, Chisom, what are the challenges of these training sessions? How do they impact diversity, equity, and inclusion objectives, either positively or negatively?
How do I answer this question? So basically, what you see these days is that companies hire another company that runs like unconscious bias training or recruitment trainings, and they do 2 sessions, maybe even a couple of sessions over 3 or 4 months. And then they're like, no, we're certified DEI experts, we're inclusive, we're good, we're fine. That's all, right? And sometimes from those experiences that they have, you know, they say, oh, let's do this amazing thing. Let's do this campaign. Or let's have this open day for people of underrepresented groups, whatever it is that comes up with. Now, to be clear, these trainings work. They work to raise awareness. And they work when they are backed by solid strategies, accountability, and measures. They don't work in a vacuum. If you only pay for 4 months or 6 months of unconscious bias training, and you expect that all of a sudden that will fix all the problems, that you will start hiring diverse groups and including them and making them feel like they belong and treating them equitably, you live in a different planet. And this is what I see happen quite a lot, you know, where DEI initiatives are concerned. So my point being, I think everything Tasha said, everything Raha said, and some of the things I've said today, if we have those foundation, then these trainings add a layer of understanding, awareness, and especially when these trainings are experiential, right? Not just theory, because sometimes the best way to actually understand something is to feel it, is if you can relate to it. So you've not had a racist experience. Have you been bullied as a child, right? Like find a ground to find experiences that people can actually relate to, so they can feel just a tiny bit what it must be like for somebody else. You know, that thing about you have to wear the shoe to know where it hurts. Because if we're just resting on theory, now let me tell you about this random story on unconscious bias. You might as well just go on Google and read about it, right? But a lot of information that we read, we don't retain them unless it actually impacts us, ideally emotionally, right? So my point being, I think that they can impact DEI objectives negatively when they are done in a vacuum. I don't care if that vacuum is 1 year, right? Well, I don't care. Well, regardless, whether that vacuum is like a full-on 1 year program. But I think they work well when they are supported by strategies and accountability that actually work.
Thank you, Chisom. It got me thinking about how we don't realize how hardwired our unconscious biases are. We have been thinking in a certain way for 30 years, and then we just expect that after a 4-month or 1 week training, we are going to change the way we think. It's not as easy as that. And we did have a session about unconscious bias as one of the D&I in the workplace sessions. So maybe for those participants who are interested in learning more about that and how it actually works, also when it comes to the brain itself, you can try to find this session on our YouTube channel. And I am coming back to Rahwa. I have a question for you. Rahwa, what does it actually take to claim the title of a DEI practitioner or a director of diversity and inclusion in a company or a business? It's a big question.
Just so I understand it correctly, you mean within a company, or like how, for example, Natasha and Chisom do it? You have to, yeah.
So we can talk about both, because I think there's a difference between calling yourself a DEI practitioner. You can be an individual who's having a business doing that, or you can be a diversity and inclusion director in a company. You know, what does it take to actually claim that title?
We know that a lot of companies now hire a lot of people, like Schibsted, for example, hired a person of color and said, hey, look at our diversity expert or whatever. And one of the things that frustrate me the most in trainings is that people, this has been mentioned several times now, people think that after taking one course or 1 week's course or a month, let's call it, they feel like they're experts. Now, we have to understand that this is not something that you learn and you're done and you're well. It is a lifelong learning process. And one of the things that really piss me off is, and intersectionality is, like, for me also, it's a buzzword that people love throwing around, but they don't understand it. They don't. And I have been in many rooms where intersectionality has been, let's say, taught. And at the end of the day, they don't understand. There's so much resistance, there's so much denial, but are we going to move past that and get to the commitment part? And also, do we understand that diversity doesn't mean, as said, inclusion, or diversity doesn't mean integration either? Who is in the room, in the places where we're making decisions? Are we there? Are people represented? Because, I mean, we can say so many things, but at the end of the day, we have to understand that we don't know better for other people. Your interests are not represented if you're not in the room. I think it's also very important that we understand what accountability means and maybe define it very precisely, because most of the times people think accountability is saying, I'm sorry. And for me, I genuinely think that that's very strange, because a lot of people say, I'm sorry, but then they go ahead and repeat the same mistakes over and over and over again. So I don't think there's such a thing as saying this company is a diversity director or diversity expert or whatever, because you'll never really get there, because it's a lifelong learning process. But you can say that I am committed and I'll keep working. So like, see, for example, we're really on the integration, or not integration, sorry, we're really on the diversity change curve. Are you as a company? If you've reached that part where you say that you're not the intercultural mindset part, well, don't think that you're done. Just keep going, keep growing that, keep growing and keep pushing that curve. But in terms of diversity experts that provide services, I think it's also, in most cases, I don't know, I am very skeptical about people that aren't really minorities doing this. I think it also comes back to equity, because that's capitalizing on people's pain. I'm very wary of that, but that's maybe a controversial opinion. What type of space are you taking up as well? Are you continuing to learn, or are you centering yourself in that? So there are so many questions. I could keep going about this for hours, but I think for what I have said so far, I think for me, it's good enough. But if you have any more questions, please direct them at me.
Can I say something?
Yes, definitely.
Or a few things. I do think that skin color as well does not necessarily make you an expert on a topic, because sometimes I see people who are of color and what they write about diversity and inclusion, I'm just like, really? Are you for real, right? Because there is this understanding that because I'm this color, then I should be good at what I do. Lived experience absolutely matters, but also education, knowledge, that continuous learning. So your skin color doesn't give you the merits. You have to continuously work for it, as Raul has said. It's a lifelong process. I also want to say something about DEI, like head of DEI at companies. I think that oftentimes, unfortunately, they serve at the, what's it called? Like they serve at the, like in, I'm losing my words, but essentially they're at the service or the mercy of their company. A lot of them, you know, are there to make suggestions. They don't actually have the power to impact the type of change they want to impact. I think that oftentimes companies are just like, oh, I had a director of DEI, well, good. That's the DEI work done, right? But they don't actually empower them with the power and the tools that they can use to actually effect change. So companies also need to rethink how they place an entire organization's responsibility and accountability on one individual who they don't actually give power to effect the change that is needed. So I also wanted to point that out.
Yes, and thank you for adding that to some, you know, this is a discussion, so of course all our panelists are welcome to add anything if they like to also answer any of the questions that are not necessarily directed to them. It's also going to be the same within the Q&A session at the end. If any of the questions are targeted at one of the panelists, but anyone else feels like adding to the point, please do so. So I also see there's a lot going on in the chat, which is amazing. Kat has been very active in there, but unfortunately he or she is not with us anymore, or them. I am not sure based on the name. Or does anyone know Kat in here? No. Well, Kat will check out our recording to get your answers later on. Yes, Rawa, I see your hand is up.
I just wanted to add something in terms of the people who provide services of diversity and inclusion and equity. I would say that they would also have to ask themselves whether they're there to make people comfortable or not. Because if you're there to make people feel comfortable, then you're doing something wrong, because this is a very heavy subject and it's a very heavy experience for many people. And there are a lot of people, like Chisom said, that's what made me think of it actually. There are a lot of people that just based on their skin color, without learning or anything, just get into this and jump into it and well, basically mislead people. I feel like the people who, buy those services keep walking away with the wrong lessons, and that's a very dangerous thing. Thank you.
Thank you for adding that, Rahwa. That could actually be a whole discussion of its own. But I do have a question for Natasha here, which is connected to her job. Because yes, so far we have learned that there is no one-size-fits-all strategy to execute training sessions within the DEI. And as such, can you share some suggestions with regards to tried, tested, and true methods that you have used successfully in planning and executing tailor-made training sessions in terms of DEI?
Yeah, okay. So I'm just going to triple dunk exactly what Rahwa and Chisholm have just said. That is to acknowledge that training is a really, really small part of ensuring that your DEI strategy is sustainable. And it complements a number of other actions. It's not a solution within itself. So I just really want to sort of really, really hammer that point home. There needs to be, training has to be supported. There has to be follow-up. There has to be continued guidance for those trainees, essentially. I mean, I would hate to see a certificate being handed out after just one training session on subconscious bias, for example, because that's not how the real world works. So, that's the first point I want to make. Within that question, I'm going to focus on the element of true. So not so much the tried and tested, but certainly the methods which are most true and most speak to the truth of the organization, because I think that's really, really important. And really, I think one of the key aspects that I would always recommend is kind of using a design approach to training. And the first starting point is really defining what the outcomes are, what success looks like. So in this case, I would really sort of sit down and really understand what, for example, equality within the business or the organization means. You know, to be a fully inclusive company, what should we be seeing, feeling, hearing that's going to be different? So what are we working towards? There has to be that common understanding and alignment. The second aspect is really understanding the participants, and that is then maybe having an understanding of the demographics of the people who are receiving that training. So that could be based on their location, it could be their level of seniority, and that in itself will then help sort of steer the characteristics and the design of training sessions itself. You may wish to look at other sort of sectional information as well, such as ethnicities and physical impairments and things like that as well. And the reason I say that is, in order to do that, that allows you really to start creating very bespoke, very tailored, very authentic sessions for your organization. You cannot take something off the shelf and assume it's going to work for you in your company. Again, life is too nuanced for you just to take something that's already there. Finally, what I'd also say as well is that, and a really important aspect, and it can sometimes be really, really overlooked actually, it might be a little bit controversial, it's about creating a safe space for those discussions within the sessions themselves. So for trainees to be able to speak their truth. So how do we do this? So, for example, there's one way that this could be done. There was a program that a friend recently reminded me of. It was over here in the UK on Channel 4 called The School That Tried to End Racism. So if I use sort of anti-racism training as an example here specifically, what they did, and sometimes what I do think is a good idea, is they created different groups to create a safe space for initial discussion to be had, to create a starting point. So you have those affected groups, for example, who discuss how they're feeling and what they would like to see happen, and then you have the non-affected groups who then are given that safe space also as well to share their concerns, their fears, or their worries. We do this a lot, for example, when organising training sessions amongst sort of junior and senior team members. You want your junior members, for example, to feel that they can speak openly without judgment. Well, we want the same thing here as well within training sessions. It's really important that people can come to the sessions and really speak their truth. So that may mean that somebody who is, say, white might wish to say, okay, I worry about getting it wrong. I worry about saying the wrong thing or using the wrong terminology. Or somebody who is in an affected group, such as a Black woman, for example, saying, well, I've seen this all before and I've heard this all before. And I know it's just gonna. So we have to create those two spaces, and that's a great starting point to have. And then from there, bring in those groups together to then look at how we design the training and embed our training into every day using those starting points that we originally came with. So those are the things that I would look at to focus more on being true than being tried and tested, if I'm honest with you.
Thank you, Natasha. You are making my brain freeze with all this content. It's video and it's amazing. I wish we had the whole day to talk about this. We even had a request from Emma if we could have, let me just say that out loud because I love the question. Emma has asked, can we please have a seminar on each of these questions individually? Well, that's just how heavy all this content is. We could actually discuss each of these questions for 2 hours and still have more to discuss. So thank you for bringing all this knowledge into this space. Thank you for the answer, Natasha. And to a buzzword that was mentioned previously, I think it was Chisholm who mentioned it briefly, it's the buzzword of the concept of lean in. Because this concept has caused some buzz on LinkedIn lately. If you haven't seen it, try to search for it. And it is widely used today. So I would just like to know your opinion, whichever of the panelists who wants to talk about it. What is the concept of lean in all about? And who does the lean in principle actually serve?
I can start. Leaning, I think, was made popular. Like leaning is a buzzword that, it's kind of like leaning to the sports, leaning to the pain, leaning to the discomfort. And I sometimes use it like leaning to why you're uncomfortable. But I think leaning in how you're asking is from the book by Sheryl Sandberg. And there's an entire organization called Leaning Now, based that arose from that. I think what it means, just kind of like as a catch-all, is to grab opportunities without hesitation, and to seek those opportunities and to continue to pursue career goals without fear. I think it's the idea that you'll be promoted regardless of whether you have small children. I read the book, and because I like to be fair, I like to read things so I can make a sound judgment on them. And it also suggests that, you may not actually have, challenges juggling work life and family. It's the idea that anyone can somehow become the CEO or God knows what now of Facebook, and all the opportunities that come with that. And is it true for some? Yes. Is it true for like the 1 to 5% of the feminist population? Absolutely. Is it true for the 90%? No, right? Because there are challenges that make it impossible, no matter how much you lean in. Sometimes you lean in. If I take myself as an example, as a Black woman, I'm aggressive when I lean in, right? Or I'm angry when I lean in. But really, I'm just trying to do what this book said that I should do to lean in and grab opportunities, right? So I think it works for some people, and admittedly for women like me, particularly me, it also works, right? I've gotten a lot of things I wanted in life by taking them, right? And working for them and getting up to the corporate ladder. I've done all that. Now, the reality is that it doesn't work for everyone. And to think that there's this one catch-all way to behave that will work for each and every woman is quite misleading, and it will lead to a lot of disappointments, right? So I think it's well-intentioned, but it did not really take a comprehensive look at the realities that people face, the realities that are compounded by their intersectionalities. And I'd really love to hear what like Rahwa and Tasha have to add to this.
If I can just say, so we have 5 minutes left of this part of this session. So we have one question left for all the participants, but if Rahwa or Natasha want to add something here, please do.
No, I think that Chisholm and I are very much on the same page as far as the concept of lean in is concerned. So yeah, I would really just echo everything she has to say on that.
Agree. I just think it's yeah, you have to understand what your accesses and disadvantages are. So in so many ways, you have to understand your privilege if you have any at all. That's the only thing I'll add. So
thank you, Rahwa. And I think we're gonna stay with you because I will start with the last question and I'll address it to you and then the other panelists as well. So it's the famous question that we like to ask at the end of each session, or at least before we jump into the Q&A with our audience. And since we have 4 minutes left, try to keep it short and crisp. So Rahwa, last question. What are your 3 tips or one powerful tip for avoiding the common mistakes of misusing DEI buzzwords and implementing measurable impact at workplace?
the simplest answer I could give is just put your money where your mouth is. Practice what you preach, say however much you want, and don't do performative things. I would much rather somebody be right out racist towards me than do some performative solidarity, because solidarity is the ability to empathize, and if you don't, just don't. The other thing I would say is keep assessing how it is going. Because you can say, yeah, we have now fostered an intercultural and inclusive mindset, but then that could slowly die out over time because people forget. We're people, we're not perfect, we forget. So keep assessing if the commitment is still being followed through with. The other one is it's okay to say, I don't know. It's okay to say, I made a mistake. And when somebody says that this is not working, just acknowledge that what they're saying is valid. Whether you agree with it or not, you're valid. I acknowledge what you're saying, and you can ask, what can we do to make it better? What can we do to improve it? And ask where you can find the information if you don't have it. Yeah.
Thank you, Rahwa. And so just for the sake of time, Natasha, what are your 3 tips or one powerful tip on how to avoid common mistakes of misusing DEI buzzwords and implementing measurable impact at the workplace?
Okay, so I guess the first thing I would say is remember individual perspective and individuality. Being a particular part of a group does not make you representative of the entirety of that group. And it certainly doesn't make you the spokesperson for that group. So that would be my first point. The second one would be, I guess, make it a strategic intent. It has to be at the heart of all organizational strategic activity rather than an afterthought. And then the third point is use your metrics, use your data as a way of continuously improving. Yes, use it to celebrate the wins. You know, you do want to give a pat on the back, but use it as a way of continuously moving forward and keeping the discussions open.
Thank you, Natasha. And we're coming now to Chisom. A lot of great tips have been given. What do you have to add?
Everything Natasha and Raha said. I think perhaps one thing that has been bothering me lately is just when you decide to use a DEI buzzword, just think about what that buzzword actually means and then what you're referring to it. So if you're saying that you have improved gender equality in your company, don't talk about diversity and inclusion if that gender equality is just of one group of people and that gender equality is quite small, right? On a ratio basis. And I think understanding the privilege that you have to actually say, okay, we're really bad at this. We're trying right now to specifically fix one thing, but ultimately we'd like to touch on this and this and this and that, because I think that way, at least for me, it helps me just understand that you know how difficult this is. And then it also saves me from like the upset that comes from reading something like that. And I think accountability, and measurement. I think it's important to attach DEI initiatives or these buzzwords you're putting out to KPIs, right? Every year, and have someone in leadership accountable for those KPIs. I think you will see remarkable change. So accountability and measurement.
Thank you so much, Chisom, for wrapping it up for us. So yes, our main or first part of this session is over. So thank you so much to all our panelists for these amazing insights and all the wisdom that you have shared with us. It has been really heavy when it comes to content. So thank you so much about that, for that. And yes, we do have a lot of questions in the chat. So if it's all right, for the panelists, we can jump right into the Q&A session, which we have 30 minutes for. I am not sure. Okay, you do have water with you. Maybe some of you need to run to the kitchen and get more water. No? All right, great. Well, then we can start. Most of the questions are open questions, not targeted to anyone. So then you are welcome to just raise your hand or unmute yourself and answer. But let's just start. So we have the first question that came in from Kat. And the question is, businesses and organizations need to do more than just inclusion, and forget that belonging needs to be added as well. So one can feel included, but not feel like they belong. What is your take on this?
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's all too easy to feel that if you have made or created inclusive policies within the organization, they are, you know, automatically going to speak of belonging and cover everything. One of the things that I would say is that what we then need to start doing as well is this is where the work in terms of listening really begins, and being able to look at the different perspectives, or can't even get the words out, different viewpoints, different ideas, for example, so that people do start to feel heard. Policies will certainly ensure that there is a measure of accountability, but at the same time, you do really want people to be heard within the organization as well. So look at the ways in which we do that. And that's where things like inclusive leadership start to come into place, and making sure that everybody has access to those conversations and those discussions that allow them to do that. Can feedback, for example, I think feedback is such an important tool to introduce. If you don't have a culture of feedback within your business, within your organization, that can really quite be detrimental to sort of creating a sense of belonging.
And if I may as well, I completely agree with Kat, I think, and also Natasha. I tend to think of DEIB, so diversity, inclusion, equity, and belonging, kind of like on a straight line. So diversity is first part, and then you have inclusion, and then you have to make sure inclusion is equitable. And I think belonging is a state of being. It's a state of feeling valued. It's kind of like the feeling of, like I can invite my friend home and they feel included in stuff, but to belong, they should be able to just come in here and sit down on the couch, put their legs up, whatever it is, where you actually feel that you are home and that you're valued as you are. So it doesn't just stop at diversity and inclusion, because inclusive policy does not necessarily translate into equity or belonging.
Yeah, I'd almost take that a step further actually as well, in the sense that there are other ways as well that you can make that more tangible, by example, how we reward people and how we recognize people as well, for example. So that will also fit into making sure that people do feel valued and do feel that they are contributing and that they are worthwhile within the organization. But it's also a continuous loop. Absolutely. So I appreciate the sort of the line, but at the end of the day, there is a loop.
Circle.
Yeah, exactly. So they all feed into each other. So I would almost see it more as a circular approach, if I'm honest.
I agree.
If I can just add something as well, I think one of the things that make people feel out of place is also cultural sensitivity, lack of cultural sensitivity training. A lot of people, let's say if you're a Muslim, for example, and you don't drink, first thing that happens is, oh, good for you, I really respect that you don't drink. And then when they're out having Christmas dinner, it's like, just have one drink. Now that makes you feel so out of place. So just cultural sensitivity training is very, very important as well.
Thank you all for responding to Kat's question. And it also just brings us to the point of how important belonging is in this whole discussion. And maybe we will bring belonging on the table as a topic of its own one day for one of the upcoming sessions. Who knows? But let's jump on the next question, which is from Teniel. I hope I am pronouncing your name well. So the question is, would you say it is best for a company to refrain from posting, recognizing DEI moments or successes probably externally, if there is still a lot of work needed in the organizational design, culture, and strategies? Who wants to dissect this one? Chisholm has unmuted herself.
Yes and no. I think that it's important to celebrate small wins. I think that it is important to give credit where it's due. So if a company that has been like largely homogeneous starts doing something and they're really proud of it as their first step, I think it's okay to recognize themselves and also announce what they are doing, so also the public can hold them accountable to it. Now, I think it is problematic when companies say, oh, look at how great we are. We just hired a trans person. We're so diverse and inclusive. And then I'm thinking, what, right? So I think it's being able to celebrate the wins, but also acknowledge the work ahead. Acknowledge where you are not currently succeeding, where you have not even given thought, and what work you plan to do. And I think because the challenge is sometimes you have companies who do a lot of work internally, but they don't communicate that outwardly. And then what that feels like for some of the employees internally is, okay, is there something you're ashamed of to support diversity and inclusion? Are you ashamed of, or are you afraid of, probably losing business, or what, people who are invested in you might think? So I think it needs to be balanced. right? But we can't celebrate, as my friend Astrid says, you can't celebrate mediocrity, right? So say, we've done this, but we have like a million steps to go, right? So I think just that awareness, so we know that you know what you're talking about.
Thank you, Chisholm, for actually quoting Astrid here, who has been our panelist previously in a few of the sessions. It's great to hear her wisdom, even without her actually being on the panel. Yes, we recognize you, Astrid, and we love you. So does Natasha or Rahwa, do you want to add anything? Because this is a big topic.
Oh, okay. I think for me, it's kind of, the same, yes and no. Again, it's just, it really, really is looking about the work that you've done and that still needs to be done. It's, you have to celebrate the wins, you do, because it is hard work. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge the steps that company take. And if that means patting your team on the back or giving an external kudos to your team members, then why not? But when it starts to overtake the real work, and that's why I was sort of saying in my earlier comment, when your team members and your colleagues, your employees can't recognize the work that you've done without looking at social media, it's because you've not done the work. And so that for me is really where my thinking comes in terms of that. So I guess I'm really just backing up everything Chisholm just said. You do need to celebrate within any sort of, when you're introducing anything that's new or you're making changes within an organization business, you do have to celebrate those. And so there's no reason not to do those. But certainly I have worked at companies or I have worked with companies who have felt happy just putting sort of, I don't know, social media posts on Instagram to celebrate their partnership with a particular organization, the fact that they've given money to that organization and haven't learned anything from it, haven't done anything with it. They just haven't taken anything from it. They've given their money, they've put it on social media, and they've given themselves a pat on the back. And it usually starts with, "We are proud." And whenever I read a post that says "we are proud," I do have to sort of like brace myself a little bit and sort of stop. But yes.
Thank you for adding that. I see Rahwa has also muted herself. Yes.
I'm going to digress a little bit. One thing that I kept thinking about when Chisholm and Natasha was speaking was how a lot of companies like to post or hang up some solidarity poster, whatever, like the black screen and the pride flag and all of that. And I think a lot of it feels like marketing to me sometimes. And I'm not going to say I would much rather not, because it's also very important that people feel like people are trying. It's a good thing. But as Natasha said, we are proud. No, you shouldn't be proud. You're just doing something that's, a basic human being should be doing. It's not something to be proud of. It's something that you should keep working on. And I also don't like, again, it also comes back to the tokenization issue, right? They're always, especially in the last year, I'm seeing always like one or another mixed person in the mix somewhere. And it's very specific to, it's a mixed person always. In the mix, in the pictures that are being posted. Maybe just, write a post and say, yeah, we're working on it. We're actively recruiting people to make our space more diverse. And we're also working on the inclusion part. Because, I mean, if you're recruiting people without actually offering them less money than what you would offer the majority, it's a good thing because you're working on the equity part as well. So you're giving, you're trying harder than, well, people that are not even hiring people. So, so it's a good thing that you market that you're trying to actively make your space more diverse, but it's also very, there's a fine line, I think. Maybe just be mindful of that.
Yes, mindfulness is always very important within, marketing, for that sake. And we do have a lot of questions here, so let's try to actually be concise with the answer so that everybody actually gets their question answered. So we have another question from Kat in here. There are actually two questions, but the second one has been answered in our last question of the session, but Kat has not been with us by then anymore. The question from Kat is, for someone who works for a company that has no DEI leaders at all, how can someone who is just an employee there make something happen from their position? Should they push for a DEI leader? And to give it some context, the person is working in a startup, so there's probably not as much finance yet. But what is your opinion here?
Okay, so I work. Oh, sorry, did you want to go, Chisholm? Sorry.
No, I was just saying, I think you should take this because you work with startups.
Yeah. Yeah, I work with startups and scale-ups, and you're right. A lot of those companies, they're at a point where they don't sort of have the money for a DEI leader. What we usually do when we're looking at those organizations initially is to really, and the question that I pose back to Kat really is what is it they want to achieve? What are they looking for? What do they feel is not in place right now that needs to be done? So I would actually go back and sort of ask that question, because it may well be that you don't need a DEI leader to do that. What you do need is just leadership to do that. And so it's not that the DEI leader will come in and fix everything and be the solutions to all things. That's really not the case at all. I always look at strategic intent. I'm always a very strategically minded person. I always bring it back to what the company wants to achieve and who the company's goals are, target audience is. In order for companies to really represent the markets they're trying to serve, it really helps for them to have a team that actually represents that at the same time as well. But essentially that understanding around what they're looking to achieve is really, really critical, and I'd say is really important. And then in really having that leadership buy-in is going to be critical. A lot of companies don't start to employ sort of a head of people or a head of talent until they're at least sort of about 30 people plus when they start to look at systems and policies and processes. So if your company is sort of within a 12-month stage, a really early stage startup, then these are things that may be sort of not an immediate focus, but things that they should definitely be focusing and working towards. So, but I would definitely encourage a conversation.
And if I can also just add quickly, I think, especially when you're working at a small organization, if they've received investments or they have money, or even if they have not, I think one of the things that could also work is the creation of affinity groups, right? So are there people within that organization who might share similar views or have similar challenges? How about you create affinity groups? Because I think those are easier to create at that early stage, and you can advocate for the group as opposed to being, that one person who always has to speak up. It becomes more of a group thing where you have that support of others and also the input and insight from others. So that's also something else to do at this early stage, is creation of affinity groups.
Thank you so much, Chisholm and Natasha. Do you want to add anything, Natasha? You have unmuted yourself.
One of the things that I was just thinking about was actually with the original point that I was making was that one of the things that I would always do is look at an impact assessment of some sort. How does not having sort of DEI policies in place or inclusive culture in place, how is that impacting the work team and colleagues, and how is it affecting culture around? That is a very, very strong argument and discussion that can then be brought and ensure that that is then tabled into the discussion. As Chisholm said, and as I mentioned earlier, a lot of investment companies, a lot of investors now, particularly at say like a pre-IPO stage, will be looking for companies they will look at their diversity policies, they will look at their inclusion policies, and it becomes part of their due diligence in actual fact.
Thank you for adding that. I hope your answers will be valuable for Kat and will be helpful. So the next question is coming in from Tendai, and it is for any of the panelists. Where does one begin in the education and knowledge of DEI? Do you have any educational long-term programs or degrees that you would recommend?
I'm currently in a wonderful DEI program at Harvard University, and it's just been amazing. So I can recommend that. It is pricey. So if you don't have that money at this point, there are actually a few courses on, say, Coursera that you could take just to start getting foundational leadership assessments and things of that nature. But I think, just start. I think start where you're like on a topic that most grabs your attention, and then build up from that. I'm not sure what Natasha or Raha thinks about this.
Yeah, accreditations I'm not so aware of, but one of the things that we often overlook is mentors and mentoring. There is such a wealth of knowledge out there, and one thing that I do know is that people are always very keen and very willing to share their knowledge and to impart that knowledge and to help you build your knowledge as well. Don't discount things like mentoring, networking, and partnering with people who are probably more experienced within that space as well.
Thank you. And I'm sure, Tendai, if you turn to Chisholm, she can give you maybe a more elaborate list of courses or you could take, or books you could read, content that you could find.
Or people to follow. There are a lot of thought leaders as well that you can follow online on LinkedIn.
Yes. So I will just read out a comment from Sam, because it's a comment to the question from Kat, and Kat is not here with us anymore. So Kat will rely on our recording. So Sam has just mentioned that in terms of, making something happen in terms of DEI in a very small company or a startup where you don't necessarily have a DEI leader. Yes, Sam is saying, I'd say this is where ensuring a workplace that fosters diverse thinking is essential and might relate to the organization's vision and mission, particularly with regard to the role of employees as the organization's ambassadors. So thank you so much, Sam, for adding your comments. We do see your contribution in the chat. Let's move on to the next question. We have 9 minutes left. I do see that we have 2 questions from Danielle, but since we already answered a few questions from Danielle, there is a question from Astrid targeted for Natasha. So I will ask that first, and then if we have time, we'll go back to Danielle's questions. So Natasha, Astrid is saying, thanks for sharing your insights on the shortcomings of the BAME label, being a handy but contrived, now my English is failing me, contrived acronym. Could you please share with us what you find more acceptable terminology, such as ethnic minority, minoritized groups, or people of color, and how do you overcome the cultural differences of terminology in different countries such as USA and UK? It was even a hard question for me to read, so I hope that you caught it all, Natasha.
I think I got it. So thanks, Astrid. Yeah, it's a tough one, and it goes back to what I was saying originally, is that labeling and umbrella terms really just allow us to create an order or to organize things, but they do remove individual perspectives. And with that in mind, there are no terms that I would recommend. There are no sort of groupings that I could think of. I do not know, and certainly could not sort of say that we should be replacing BAME with something else. I know that's a term that I don't like, but I know that some other people do definitely identify with it and are happy to use it. Is there a term that actually replaces that or makes it better? No, absolutely not. And so 9 times out of 10, I go back to individual perspective and saying, what does this individual want to be identified as and known as? And I think it really goes back to that. It is the individual and their own identity. There's never going to be a one size fits all in terms of how we group people. There just can't be. We're too nuanced, we're too complex, we're too beautiful to do that. So we shouldn't, in my humble opinion. Also as well, culturally, I know that, for example, in America, the term BAME doesn't exist. I believe a lot of people don't actually understand what that term is. I was really surprised at that. I didn't know that, but I learned that from a friend. And so again, those cultural differences are really important. If I go to America, I guess I'm what, Afro-Caribbean, African, I don't even know if I'm Caribbean British or how they would identify me over there, actually.
African American?
African American, but I'm not African and I'm not American. So that's the thing. I'm Black, British, Caribbean. I can carry that around the world as far as I see. But yeah, I don't think there is a one size fits all approach to that at all. I really, really don't. But Chisholm and Rawa, I don't know what you have to say.
I'll let Raha go because I talk a lot. So let's hear from Raha. There's a question about BIPOC as well.
I can just repeat what I thought was the main part of the question. So what you find are what is acceptable terminology when we're speaking about ethnic minorities or minoritized groups or people of color? So it's all about terminology.
I think the best thing you can do is really talk to them and ask them rather than labeling them yourself. I usually say racialized peoples because that is more encompassing and very general instead of, you know, this and this and that, because Black can be so many different things, for example, right? But just ask people because people identify differently. And I think that's the best way to go about it.
Yeah, I was just gonna also second that because recently my attention was drawn to a platform that measures inclusion, and just the foundational questions they ask you. You know, they ask you to define your ethnicity, and it's just like picking one thing, like Black, white, this, that, and I'm thinking, okay, what about for people who have multiple race or identities? Like, how do they actually get to decide? So you're forcing them to decide the one that, yeah, I think it's somewhat ridiculous. And also on America, because I'm doing a lot now with the US and of course taking courses in the US as well. Oftentimes I have to fill out forms, and the forms usually just say African American, and we're just like, well, I'm not African American. So I always end up going, and I think he has to make a point. I know I could say African American, but I end up going, like making a point by clicking other. And then when they say explain more, I say Nigerian. Right? It's just because you can't quantify people as the same because they have the same skin color.
Thank you for adding that, Chisholm. So we have 3 minutes left from the session. And 2 questions from Tanielle. So question 1, how do you attract a more diverse pool of talent or make people feel included even before they are interviewed? So I guess inclusion within the recruitment process. Who wants to answer this one?
Okay.
I have a very quick, Natasha, you go. No, I have a very quick answer to that. I'm sure Chisom and Natasha have something to add about that. And I think do the work, and the word will go around, like people will know. And that's when people will be more positive to apply jobs there.
My 2 pence is that you can ask. So for example, you're not expected to have all the answers at all in terms of how to make it fully inclusive. But what you can do, for example, is within your hiring statements and your job adverts is perhaps write something along the lines of, please let us know what we can do to make this experience more positive for you, for example, and ask the person what you can do. So those are things, for example, small, but they're effective.
And I agree with both Tasha and Rahwa. I think there's also something about the language that you use in your job ads or in recruitment. There's also something about searching for diverse candidates from different pools that you normally do. Like in Norway, for example, they hire from like 5 schools, right? So if you don't go to any of those schools, God help you. Now, don't just do these things to do them, actually do the work in-house. Make sure you're ready to receive them. Make sure you're ready to include them. Right, make sure you're also ready to receive feedback. But yes, I think asking is a good start. And just as from a general perspective, action speaks louder than words. So you can shout on top of the mountain every day, like, oh my gosh, we're so inclusive, we're diverse, we're diverse, we're diverse. We see you, we're not stupid, and we can tell.
Yes, if I may just add, it also makes me think back on Natasha's answer about, the need for having a strategy. And that also applies in recruitment. You should have a proper recruitment strategy that is inclusive. Before you actually start interviewing people, it should be in place. Natasha, you're unmuted.
I would just finally add on that note that you need to have a really firm understanding of what good looks like in a role. You have to have it defined, you've got to have it articulated, you've got to be able to assess for it, and you've got to make sure that your hiring managers know how to recognize it. That should work.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So this has been our last question, and our time is up. Unfortunately, I know that we would be able to keep on having this discussion for hours upon hours, but it has been an amazing 2 hours. And I would like to thank all our panelists and, of course, as well, our audience for being here, for contributing, for sharing your knowledge, and, just for doing the work and educating us, because having these discussions is extremely important. So thank you. As I have